Alright, so we've got Chapter 13, The Rise of a Mass Democracy. This is probably the most important chapter, most heavily tested chapter of the Unit 3. So the Unit 3 is going to take us all the way to the end of the first trimester, chapters 13 through 16. And really, Chapter 13 is the most heavily covered one because of Andrew Jackson, my guy. There's so many things that happened during his presidency, and there's also some big, a couple big things to talk about in the John Quincy Adams administration, as well as the Martin Van Buren administration. So how does it start? It starts with the election of 1824, which quickly becomes known as the corrupt bargain of 1824. And so the major players, two of the four major players are here's some daguerreotypes of them right here. You've got Henry Clay, who we've already talked about for a couple chapters now. Remember, he's the father of the American system. He was one of the war hawks from, I believe it was Kentucky. He definitely voted for the War of 1812. Then over here, you've got John Quincy Adams, the son of President John Adams. He had an impeccable record as an ambassador overseas, and he was the Secretary of State. Remember, he was the Secretary of State when Andrew Jackson invaded Florida, and he stuck up for Andrew Jackson and was able to get the Adams-Onis Treaty as a result of that. So you can see that both of them, they don't look like real happy guys, do they? I mean, this is the types of the politicians, I guess, of the 1820s were very different than the politicians of the 21st century, where all they have nowadays are those cheesy smiles. These guys pretty much look like they could be bad guys in horror movies. And another guy, William Crawford. Never heard of him? Don't worry about it. You'll never hear of him again after this slide. So the four candidates, and they were all actually from the same political party. The Democratic Republicans were the only ones in town. The Federalists were dead, and the political parties hadn't split yet. So there was Andrew Jackson, who you're going to see on the next slide. He was the military hero. He's from Tennessee. He's got a lot of support out west. He was a very, very popular candidate. Then you had John Quincy Adams. He was from New England. His claim to fame was being Secretary of State, and most importantly, his dad was the president, right, the second president. You had Henry Clay, who we talked about last slide. He's the Speaker of the House, the current Speaker of the House. He was a deal maker. And then you get this guy, William H. Crawford from Georgia. You don't really need to know him. There's a funny little tale. Next slide. So you got the election of 1824, and you can see that the four guys all kind of split the vote, right? So here's the popular vote, and here's the electoral vote right here. You can see that in New England, John Quincy Adams dominated the New England area. You can see that Crawford actually wins Virginia, which was a very important state. Look at all those electoral votes. And Georgia, and then a couple random counties here and there. You see, Jackson is by far the most, wins the most of both electoral votes in 99 and the popular vote, 153,000. And then you can see Henry Clay gets his home state of Kentucky, Ohio, Missouri, and a little bit of western New York right here. Now, according to the 12th Amendment, you become president once you win a majority of the electoral vote. But you can see here that nobody has won the requisite 51%. So according to Article 12, or I'm sorry, the 12th Amendment, the top three electoral vote getters have a runoff election in the House of Representatives. So if you look at this chart, you get Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, and Crawford. So the loser, the guy who comes in fourth place, is Henry Clay. The issue here becomes the Speaker of the House, the place where the runoff election is going to happen. The Speaker of the House is Henry Clay. So even though that he is precluded from becoming president in 1824, he pretty much holds who actually will become president in the palm of his hand. Here's just a table you can see here. All right. Shortly after the election, prior to it going to the House of Representatives, that Crawford guy from Georgia suffers a stroke, and it's a paralytic stroke, so he's basically a vegetable now. So there's no way that the House of Representatives is going to let this guy win. So it becomes a two-horse race in between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. Now here's the deal. Henry Clay absolutely hated Jackson. And it makes sense. They're both from the West, whereas Henry Clay was a war hawk. Andrew Jackson was the real deal, right? He was the general. And Henry Clay was kind of, if he would have been born earlier, he may have been a Federalist because he did believe in he created the American system, right? Which increased a lot of federal power, whereas Andrew Jackson was against federal power on the whole. So, philosophically, Henry Clay, even though he wasn't friends with John Quincy Adams, he kind of pushes the House to supporting John Quincy Adams. And they had a meeting, shortly before the vote, and no one knows what was said in that meeting, but John Quincy Adams becomes president, and a few days later, he of course names Henry Clay as the new Secretary of State. All the Jackson supporters cry foul. They start calling Henry Clay the Judas of the West, which is a kind of a cool nickname. And John Quincy Adams has kind of negative publicity and popularity really for his entire presidency the next 4 years. The election for 1832, the campaigning for it really starts right after the corrupt bargain in 1824. So during the election now, campaigning for 1828, the Democratic Republicans, start to coalesce into two separate camps. You get the National Republicans, who are voting for John Quincy Adams for re-election, and then you have the Democratic Republicans, who they're retaining their original name, that are sticking up for Jackson. And even it kind of makes sense if you think about the name difference. National sounds like a federal, right? I mean, it's like a more centralized type, and that's what Adams was. It was more like a federalist. Democratic, it's more of the people, right? It's more of the state's interests, less powerful federal government. So there you go. Jackson is portrayed as the common frontiersman, right? Grows up in a log cabin, and he's an Indian fighter, and he's just kind of a cool dude. He's portrayed as. On the other hand, John Quincy Adams is portrayed as an effete, feminine, corrupt aristocrat. Lots of mudslinging. The mudslinging back then was far worse than you see nowadays. It's something that modern pundits, when they think about how bad campaigning has gotten with campaign finance reform or lack of campaign finance reform, and the rumors that are spread about certain candidates nowadays, that it's absolutely nothing compared to how it was during this time period. I mean, the Jackson supporters actually they just made this up. They called John Quincy Adams a pimp. Right? I mean, you don't get that now. The worst thing that happened is when that one guy during the State of the Union address called Obama a liar. That's and then everybody went nuts over that. Well, no one has accused Barack Obama of pimping out a girl for the Russian leader. In this case, it'd be Putin. So this is the first modern presidential campaign. Lots of mudslinging, like I said. They're appealing to the masses because most states had abolished or highly reduced their property requirements. So now, if you were a white male adult, you could pretty much vote. And so there's a lot of get out the vote campaigns. And you can see Jackson absolutely destroys John Adams in the election. I mean, besides from that one pocket there in the New England area, Andrew Jackson wins every other area. 68% of the vote, which is an absolute landslide, and the electoral vote is 178 to 83, which is absolutely massive. So the first thing you gotta know about the Jackson presidency is something called the spoils system. And the spoils system, well, it's a pretty simple concept, and it's still around today, both at the national level and the local level. and it's as soon as you are elected to an office, you fire the old guys and you hire a bunch of new guys. And the guys that you hire, they are the guys that helped you get elected. So you're rewarding political supporters with, public jobs basically. Now, I don't know if this year's AP test will have it, but in a lot of AP tests, they have political cartoons. There's almost always one or two in every test, and a very, very common subject area for them to show in a political cartoon is Andrew Jackson. So you see this exact political cartoon a lot. And so this is Andrew Jackson riding on the back of a hog. Right? You can see dollar signs here, and you can see there's fraud, bribery, plunder, and then it says to the victor belong the spoils. Andrew Jackson. Let's see, dollar make and spoils over here. The point of this, what you should read into this political cartoon, is that Andrew Jackson he is epitomizing the spoils system, and it's because I don't know if historians just think he was the first guy to do this or what, or maybe he did it the most, but Andrew Jackson replaced a bunch of public officials with guys who helped him get elected. Now, as your book states, a lot of these original guys that he fired needed to be put out to pasture. There's a lot that were still remaining from the Washington and Adams administration decades before. And they weren't doing anything. They're just collecting a paycheck now at the age of 70, 80 years old. So it was definitely time for some new blood to get in there. But Andrew Jackson's kind of blamed for the starting the spoils system, which continues to this day. The next big event in Jackson's presidency is the Tariff of Abominations, which actually starts in 1828 before Andrew Jackson even becomes president. And the central figure in this is this crazy looking dude here, John C. Calhoun, right? Who is actually Andrew Jackson's vice president. So the Jacksonites, the guys who are actually supporting Andrew Jackson, they wanted to hurt John Quincy Adams in an election year. Right? It's very, very similar type of stuff that they do nowadays, where the political opponents try and pass BS bills to try and harm politically either a congressman or in this case a president, to force them to veto something or force them to accept that. I mean, it's this current crisis that we had in government now, with the government slimmed down and the default crisis and Obamacare and all that type of stuff. I mean, the Democrats and the Republicans were constantly passing bills that they knew would never be passed, but they give them fancy, warm fuzzy titles, and then when the other side votes against it, then they can go in front of the press and say, oh, this guy doesn't like children, or this guy doesn't wants people to starve to death, or this person believes in death panels and all this other nonsense. But it wasn't invented by the current Congress. It had been done a long time ago. So what is the Tariff of Abominations? It was a high tariff bill, and it was passed by the Jacksonites, who didn't even really want the high tariff bill themselves, but they wanted to hurt Adams. They thought that if Adams signed into law the high tariff bill, what would happen is that he would maintain his support in New England, which he already had support, but the rest of the country would hate him. If he vetoed this high tariff bill, then what would happen is he would actually the South and the West still wouldn't vote for him because they didn't like him, and he would lose support in New England. So Adams signs it into law, right? So he's pleasing his constituency. The South gets hit the hardest by this tariff law, right? Your book doesn't really say, but it's going to be far above 20 to 25% general tax. So the South gets hit the hardest because they have to buy manufactured goods domestically at an inflated price because of this tariff, and yet they sell their cotton overseas in an unregulated tariff-free environment. Except that some places are pissed off at our high tariff, and so they actually place a tariff or tax on American exports. And the only thing that we were really exporting back then were agricultural products in general and cotton in particular. So New England loves this tariff. The South hates this tariff. So this is where you get the South Carolina Exposition. It was a pamphlet that was written in secret, and the author was the Vice President John C. Calhoun. And it expands this nullification doctrine, this nullification theory that was started in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions authored by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. The nullification is based on that compact theory whereby the country was not created by the people, it was created by the states. A compact, or an agreement, a contract between the original 13 states, or 13 colonies, I should say. And as such, they should have the final say on a federal law within their own borders. So New York could not, tinker with a federal law in Virginia borders, but New York could tinker with a federal law within New York borders if you ascribe to this nullification theory. And that's what South Carolina does, is they declare the Tariff of Abominations null and void. So according to them, it does not exist anymore in South Carolina. And of course, this is also, they're trying to help South Carolina because the biggest port really in the South, aside from New Orleans, was Charleston. So what does President Jackson do in response to this Tariff of Abominations? Well, in typical Jackson style, he makes plans to invade the state of South Carolina and to kill the legislators who passed the law. And he tells the Army and the Navy to basically get ready, get in position, and he's going to make South Carolina pay big time for challenging Andrew Jackson. Turns into a personal battle. You see here that Henry Clay, who's still around, the great compromiser, he's still in the House of Representatives, and he is able to pass the Compromise Tariff of 1833, which gradually reduces the tariff rates over, I believe it was a 6-year period, to rates from the 18 teens. However, the government also passes something called the Force Bill, which authorized President Jackson to use the Army and the Navy to enforce the collection of the tariff if South Carolina chose to still fight this. This is another one of Andrew Jackson's little cartoons that you see tested a lot. It's definitely a negative Andrew Jackson cartoon, just like the last one. Here he's being depicted as a monarch. It's tough to see right here, but this is actually supposed to be a copy of the Constitution, or an original of the Constitution that he has shredded with his fancy shoes. And you can see here holding in his hand the veto. And we're going to talk about that in the next slide or so with the bank. In other words, that Andrew Jackson is acting like a monarch who's destroying the Constitution and acting like a tyrant because of his use of. The next thing, though, that we're going to talk about Andrew Jackson before we get to the bank war is the Trail of Tears and the Cherokee Nation. And so here's a map. You can see the Cherokee. They were considered one of the 5 civilized tribes because they had adopted a lot of white customs and schooling and Christianity and all this other stuff. And you can see that they were located in modern day Georgia, a little bit of Alabama, a tiny bit of Tennessee, and a little bit of North Carolina. But mostly Georgia. And of course, what happens is, the people want that land. It's pretty good land. And so the governor of Georgia basically declares the Cherokee Nation null and void and tries to, evict them and take their land. And so the Cherokee do something extremely Indian, right? You're probably thinking, all right, they threw a bunch of feathers in their hair, sharpen their arrows, grab their bows, and attack some white settlements. No, the Cherokee did something even more Indian. They sued Georgia in court and took it all the way to the Supreme Court. And here's another cartoon of Andrew Jackson being depicted as kind of a paternal figure in a negative light. And who are his children? Indians. This one looks like a devil, but I still think it's supposed to be an Indian. So he's called the Great Father here. So I told you that in 1823 or 1828, Georgia declares the Cherokee Council illegal, and Andrew Jackson, along with a lot of support in Congress, let's face it, they pass the Indian Removal Act of 1830, where they try and kick out all Indians east of the Mississippi and move them west of the Mississippi. It's theorized that there was about 120 to 150,000 Indians that lived east of the Mississippi at this time period, and over 100,000 of them were forcibly moved. And here you can see them walking along the way from Georgia to modern-day Oklahoma, and apparently they were crying, hence the Trail of Tears. Here's the route, right? Apparently Seminoles, they swam. Now, the thing I want to point out here are the Sauk Indians and the Fox Indians of modern-day Illinois, Iowa. They refused to leave. They were led by this guy named Chief Black Hawk. Sound familiar? And they fought. They didn't want to leave. And of course, the Americans crushed them. And two of the better known individuals who fought in the Black Hawk War were future Confederate President Jefferson Davis and a young guy by the name of Abraham Lincoln. And there they are. That is Chief Black Hawk right here. And I covered up his son's face because who gives a crap about his son? But our own Stanley Cup champion, two-time in the last couple of years, Blackhawks. The logo is supposed to be Chief Blackhawk, and if you look, it's not a bad likeness actually. This is supposed to be a painting, and he's kind of westernized here. But if you Indian him up with some war paint and some feathers, it's pretty dead on, I would say. All right, we finally get to the bank war. So you'll recall that the National Bank suffered from a publicity crisis in the financial panic of 1819. Remember that the bank foreclosed on a lot of western farms because guys weren't making their mortgage payments. What happens is this makes the people who lost their homes, their farms out west, they hate the bank, right? That makes sense. If the bank takes your property. In addition to that, factions in some states still hated it after McCulloch versus Maryland because they didn't like the idea that there was this private bank that was kind of part of the federal government, but not really. You still could make a lot of money as a private investor, and yet the federal government would deposit all of its money in this, kind of federal creature that doesn't exist in the Constitution. Henry Clay, our guy, he's going to run for president now in 1832 again. He's going to try and beat Andrew Jackson. So he tries to do something that the Jacksonites, whatever you call it, tried to do to John Quincy Adams with the Tariff of Abominations. They present a bill. Even though the bank was supposed to go for another 4 years, they present a bill in Congress to renew the bank in order to make it an election year issue. And they're going to try and hurt politically President Andrew Jackson. So if they renew the bank, in other words, if Jackson signs it, then he's going to piss off a lot of people out west and out south because they hate the bank. And remember, that's where he got a lot of his support from. You also got to remember that Henry Clay himself is from Kentucky, and most of his support was also from the west and the south. So this was his idea of how he would be able to hurt Andrew Jackson in an area where they both had their constituent base. Now, if Jackson vetoes the bank, he's going to alienate the New England area, the East. And the East was already inclined to vote for Henry Clay because of the American system that he created. So Henry Clay thought he was doing something extremely slick, because however Jackson voted, whether he vetoed it or didn't, Henry Clay believed that Jackson would be hurt politically. In typical Jackson style, Jackson says "screw you" when he vetoes it. Right? He basically says it's unconstitutional, and he vetoes it. He doesn't say why it's unconstitutional. He doesn't expand on the idea that the national bank had pretty much been around since our nation's founding, and no one had challenged on a official level its constitutionality before. And let's face it, the Supreme Court said it was constitutional in McCulloch versus Maryland. But Jackson didn't care. He just vetoes it anyway. And he's the first president to veto something basically just because he didn't like it, other than rooting the basis of the veto on constitutional law grounds. In fact, here's his quote: "The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." Here's another political cartoon of Andrew Jackson admiring his handiwork here. You got Henry Clay. I forget who these guys are. I think Daniel Webster is maybe one of these guys, another random dude. And here's Nicholas Biddle, who is the head of the bank, and this is the bank, and you can see he's just coughing up money here, and we'll describe why in a second. So, like I said before, this is the first veto not based on constitutionality. Jackson just didn't like it. By doing this, it increases the power of the president because now he can basically say, I'm just as powerful as 2/3 of both houses of Congress, because that's the only way that you could overturn a veto. It's a bold move on an executive branch part. Of course, the people love it, right? The American people love a badass, and Andrew Jackson was a badass. So he easily wins a second term, and he just doesn't let it die, right? So the bank's gonna run out and not exist anymore come 1836 anyway. But Andrew Jackson's like, no, we're gonna kill it now. It becomes a fight between him and the bank president, Nicholas Biddle. And so, how do you kill a bank? Well, you deprive a bank of its blood, and its blood is money. And so Jackson orders the halt to new deposits, and he pays for government debts out of the money that's already there. So he's slowly taking money out of the bank, and he's putting no new money in. And like I said, a bank without money is not a bank. Another political cartoon of Henry Clay trying to sew Andrew Jackson's mouth shut. They're trying to stop him. Here's a political cartoon of Andrew Jackson fighting the president of the National Bank, Nicholas Biddle. Andrew Jackson's now vice president. He got rid of Calhoun. This guy is Martin Van Buren, who's a funny-looking guy. And I guess looking over here is, I believe, Daniel Webster and Henry Clay. Here's Andrew Jackson slaying the bank hydra. Remember, he said it was like a serpent with many heads, and he's slashing it with his sword, and he's pulling along Martin Van Buren on his coattails. Okay, so now what happens with this? You get the Bank of the United States pretty much doesn't exist anymore. The federal government now is depositing its money in banks throughout the country. And what happens is these banks become known as wildcat banks or pet banks. They're really the book makes a distinction between the two of them. I don't really think you need to know the distinction between the two of them. So I think for purposes for this class and for the AP test, pet banks and wildcat banks can be one and the same. But what's happening is, although the federal government would mint hard currency, so they would create it themselves, individual banks would print up paper money. And we've already talked a little bit about the problems of this. And if you have all these different banks around the country printing up paper money as opposed to one national bank, you could have lots of different types of currencies from lots of different types of banks in your possession at any one time. And as a result of that, it's tough to know if your dollar actually is worth $1. Could be a lot more, could be a lot less. And because you have so many different types of money from so many different types of banks who are each having their own financial hardships or boom time periods, the value of these various paper currencies would fluctuate wildly. And this was really hurting the economy. Lots of speculation are happening, over speculation, frankly, of people just buying obscene amounts of land in Louisiana Territory with these random paper currencies. And so the Specie Circular is passed in 1836, and it states that you can only buy federal land with hard currency, with gold or silver. So you couldn't use paper money to purchase real estate. And I have here, what's Jackson's goal? Well, I mean, let's face it, Jackson's goal was that, he did not want to admit that the national bank was a necessity, and he would have to admit that it was a mistake killing it, and so he's trying to fix it. So what's the results of this law, the Specie Circular? Well, banknotes lose their value, so the paper money loses its value. Land sales plummet, so instead of over speculation in land, you actually kind of get an under speculation in land because there's not enough hard currency to go around. Credit is not available. What I mean by credit is banks are unwilling to give loans to people. So if you're a farmer, you're not able to secure a loan. Businesses who need loans a lot to start business and even to maintain a business during the lean times or for expansion purposes, they begin to fail and unemployment rises. And so you get our second big uh, financial crisis of the new nation, and it's called the Panic of 1837. Now, the Panic of 1819 was caused by overspeculation in the real estate market. The Panic of 1837 is almost from the opposite effect, but in this case, it's not the real estate isn't the root cause, it's currency is the root cause of this one. And a lack of a unified paper currency really is what causes it because there just wasn't enough hard currency to go around. You can't just print up a silver coin or a gold coin. You have to actually physically possess a certain amount of silver and gold. And if America didn't have that, then they can't do that. Throughout Andrew Jackson's administration, his supporters slowly drop the Republican term and they just start calling themselves Democrats. And they believe in individual rights, states' rights, federal restraint, and social and economic affairs. Very, very similar, I would say, to the modern day Republican Party platform. Ironically enough, though, they're the Democrats. Jackson's opponents, they basically accuse him of being a usurper, a king, a tyrant, and so they form a political party that had been in place in England against the tyrannical abuses of monarchical power, and that English political party were called the Whigs. And so these Americans who were opposed to Andrew Jackson's tyranny, they call themselves the Whigs again. So you have now a new political party in America, and they're kind of all over the map though in their beliefs. They're not unified at all. They tend to be more conservative. They tend to be similar to the Federalists in their appeal as far as a strong federal government and weaker state governments, and they definitely think that the federal government, has a place in social and economic affairs. But in addition to that, a lot of them were kind of like anti-Masons. They didn't like the secretive Freemasons. Some of them didn't like slavery at all and wanted to see it abolished. Some just didn't want to see it expanded into the territories. Some of them were anti-immigrant, so they were kind of just all over the map in there. This is just a photo of Andrew Jackson. I believe it's the last one that exists. It's about a year before his death. He dies in 1845. Looking grumpy as hell there. So Jackson only stays in the honor of George Washington at 2 terms. And so 1836, Andrew Jackson kind of pushes forth his running mate, his vice president, Martin Van Buren, king of the mutton chops over here. He's the hand-picked successor. Now, the slow death of the bank was already hurting the economy. The Panic of 1837, which really is part of the Martin Van Buren administration. The foundation for this panic was laid though during the Jackson administration. And it's really only modern historians that are willing to give Andrew Jackson blame for it. But at the time, Andrew Jackson was very well liked, and this problem just drops in Martin Van Buren's lap. But real bad problem, right? You got factories are closed, people are unemployed, savings are lost. And their solution was something called an independent treasury. This is where they completely take away federal funds from private banks. So the federal government would actually hoard its own money. It wouldn't even use any of the banking system whatsoever. So they're taking it even a step further. Not only have they killed the national bank, but now they're not even depositing their money in any of these pet or wildcat banks. So this takes even more money out of circulation and hurts the economy even worse. Okay, Texas. Texas kind of seems like it's grafted onto this chapter, but the reason why they have to put it in this chapter is because chronologically, there's a lot happening in this state and future foreign country. So where do we start? 1823. Mexico is a newly independent nation, and it gives this guy, Stephen Austin. Stephen Austin was the leader of about 300 families, and it gives him a contract so that he can populate the state of Texas. Now, 300 families for, at that time was an absolutely massive geography is nothing. But the reason why Mexico jumped at this was because almost nobody lived in Texas at the time. So the type of people that are settling into Texas, you get a lot of guys who are running from the law, and it was kind of almost like a fugitive camp. And so they're kind of the rougher, more sinister elements of society. They were Americans though, even though they're in technically Mexico. Many of them didn't speak Spanish and didn't really, were not ethnic Mexicans or mestizos. They were white Americans from their descendants from England. So there was a lot of cultural differences here, and they retained their American autonomy, I'll say. 1830, Mexico dropped slavery, and they demand that the Texans release their slaves according to Mexican law, and the Texans refuse. So hostilities slowly start to build up, and the leader of Mexico, a guy by the name of Santa Anna, in 1839, he basically abolishes Texas autonomy, all their local rights, and he invades. And the Republic of Texas. Texas declares itself and secedes essentially from Mexico and declares its independence. And for you're going to see almost 10 years or so, Texas is an independent country. Now, so they have their own Revolutionary War, and it's fairly small scale with some pretty memorable battles. The most memorable one is here at the Alamo on March 6th, 1836, but then also the Battle of San Jacinto, where they secure their independence on April 21st, 1863, or 1836. I'm sorry. What I like about the book is it says that the Americans maintained a naval superiority against the Mexicans, and they say they were able to do this with a whopping 4 ships. So there's the Alamo. Here's the highlights. 1836, Texas declares its independence. Santa Anna and 6,000 men invade Texas, and they surround the Alamo, which is an old Spanish mission, and they kill, after I believe it was a 13-day siege, maybe a 16-day siege, they kill all 200 Texans at the Alamo. So they took no surrender whatsoever. Two of the big names that were at the Alamo were Jim Bowie and Davy Crockett. They become martyrs. Really galvanizes opinion not just in Texas but in other neighboring states in the United States, who now funnel in weapons, money, and supplies to the Texans. And Sam Houston is the leader of the Texas Army, and he retreats. He's pulling Santa Anna ever farther away from Mexico proper to extend Santa Anna's supply lines, and Sam Houston is thereby shortening his own supply lines because he's bringing it closer and closer to the rest of America. There's just another picture, tourist picture of Remember the Alamo. I have here, don't mess with Texas. Texans crush superior Mexican force at San Jacinto. They actually capture General Santa Anna, and they hold a Bowie knife up to his throat, and they force him to sign a bunch of treaties. And Santa Anna does so and agrees to withdraw his troops and to make the Rio Grande River the border between independent country of Texas and the independent country of Mexico. Texas then promptly requests admittance into the U.S. because remember it was populated by U.S. citizens. It didn't really want to be an independent country, and America says no. And America says no because there were no territories that were free, that were going to be safe from the expansion of slavery into their territory. And remember that according to the Missouri Compromise, they're trying to maintain that balance in the Senate between slave states and free states. If you let Texas in, then you're going to have an imbalance. They're going to have one more slave state, in other words, two more pro-slave senators, and it would be too much. Now, brings us to the election of 1840. Martin Van Buren was not a popular president whatsoever because of the Panic of 1837. And so the Whigs put forth their candidate, and you have William Henry Harrison. He was part of the War of 1812, and it took place, or it was commander of an American victory at Tippecanoe. And so you get the awesome saying, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. William Henry Harrison takes on the nickname of Tippecanoe, the scene of his battle. And then you have John Tyler, who is, your book says he was an afterthought. He wasn't an afterthought. He was actually a Democrat. He was a Jackson supporter, and they put him on the ticket so that they could steal some votes away from the Democrats, who were led by Martin Van Buren. Van Buren, like I said, was very unpopular because of the economy, and the Whigs do the same thing to Martin Van Buren that the Jacksonites did to John Quincy Adams. They portray Van Buren as a corrupt, effete aristocrat from the New England area. The Whigs, they do, again, the same thing to Tippecanoe as the Jacksonites did to Jackson. They portray their guy as this big war hero, as this Westerner who grew up in a log cabin and drank hard cider and all this other stuff. And it worked, right? I mean, Harrison wins. The problem with Harrison is when on the inauguration day, which back then was in early March, he decides to act like a badass and he doesn't wear a coat. And he gives this big long speech out in the cold weather, and he gets a cold, and that cold turns into pneumonia, and he dies. So he was president for a whopping 1 month, and for almost that entire month, he was semi-conscious in bed. So there's the glorious reign of William Henry Harrison. This is just one of the campaign, I think it was a handkerchief, and you can see here the Whigs in 1840 and Reform. The Whigs in 1776, the expenses of the government, and it has here William Henry Harrison's fictitious log cabin and the barrel of hard cider that he was drinking. The last slide of the lecture, our chronology slide. You can see here that the corrupt bargain of 1824, where John Quincy Adams becomes president. You can see 1828, the Tariff of Abominations, and Jackson is elected president. This is also when the South Carolina Exposition is published. 1830, the Indian Removal Act. 1832, you get the Bank War, where Jackson vetoes the bill to recharter the Bank of the United States. You also got the Black Hawk War that happens in our neck of the woods. Jackson defeats Clay for the presidency. He's reelected. You get the nullification crisis of the Tariff of Abominations. It's occurring pretty much at the same time of the Bank War. You get Henry Clay's Compromise Tariff of 1833. And then you also have Jackson removing federal deposits from the Bank of the United States. 1836, the Bank of the United States is completely gone. You get that Specie Circular problem that happens. They create the Bureau of Indian Affairs. I forgot to talk about the Indian Removal Act of 1830. And then here in Texas, you got the Battle of the Alamo, Battle of San Jacinto, Texas wins its independence, and also Van Buren elected president. And then you have the Panic of 1837 that occurs. You get the Trail of Tears that occurs in the late 1830s with the Cherokee. You get the Independent Treasury established in 1840, and you get William Henry Harrison defeats Van Buren for the presidency. Remember, Tippecanoe and Tyler too.